Afghanistan today woke up to a country that was fully under the grip of the Taliban. The capital of Kabul today is a picture of chaos, anxiety and fear. Several Afghans have swooped down upon the Kabul International Airport in a desperate bid to flee the country. Some of the scenes from the airport show people trying to forcibly enter departing planes and flooding the runway trying to clutch onto the planes. These are the most telling images of the crisis in Afghanistan today. Amidst this frenzy, 5 people have reportedly been killed, although it is unclear who fired on them or how they died. There is massive fear amongst Afghans over the hardline brand of the Islamic rule of the Taliban and the uncertainty over their future. With President Ashraf Ghani fleeing the country, Afghans feel abandoned and angry, asking why the international community didn't come to their rescue. Meanwhile, the United Nations Security Council will meet today to discuss the situation. Well, to get a perspective on what the fall of Afghanistan into Taliban hands means, what it means for the security of the region and what it means for Afghanistan itself, Professor Scott Lucas, who is a US and British foreign policy expert and an international affairs expert. We're also joined by the former Afghan Presidential Adviser, Torek Farhadi. Gentlemen, thank you so much for speaking to Mirror Now. I appreciate you taking time out this afternoon. Torek Farhadi, we've seen the scenes from the airport in Kabul. It is a picture, it is a most telling image of the desperation and the fear amongst people. They want to leave Afghanistan and they want to leave Afghanistan before things get any worse. Now, there has been a lot of talk about whether this Taliban is any different from the earlier Taliban. Do you think such beliefs or such hopes are completely misplaced? And what we're seeing is we're going back 20 years once again?
On some of the aspects, yes. On some of the aspects, no. Yesterday, Taliban entered into Kabul without a bullet being fired by any side. And that was very fortunate for us because right now inside Kabul, we have nearly 10,000 refugees from the north who escaped the fighting in the north, and they're sleeping in the streets and parks in Kabul. And a firefight in Kabul or resistance in Kabul would have been devastating. In fact, there was no resistance from the people to Taliban taking over, and there was no resistance from the people anywhere in Afghanistan. We must note that Taliban have taken over Afghanistan militarily, but mostly politically. Most of the provinces that they took over was by negotiation. And in the last segment of that, 3 trusted advisors of President Ghani, who were the governor of Ghazni and governor of Logar and governor of Jalalabad, they offered their provinces to Taliban. And this is when it became apparent for President Ghani that when his trusted advisors had made deals with the Taliban to offer their provinces, there was no room for him to stay. Nobody was going to fight for him. And the population of Kabul was tired of fighting, and they were ready for the Taliban as long as the Taliban can bring peace. Why is the population escaping today? This is the international community which called on a number of people to leave. People who have worked for the government, for the armed forces, they are not sure at what will happen next, and nobody knows what will happen next, although the Taliban have given declarations that we will not bother you. But people want to leave, like people want to leave Ghana and Chad and Africa. They want to leave, and there are planes that are leaving, and there are rumors that anybody can get on those planes. And you see a bunch of people who probably don't even qualify for those visas, but they are at the airport in case they can get on a plane. And today we had this image, which will be an image like Saigon for history books, where a few young people clung onto the aircraft, and then later they fell on the ground, and they found their bodies on the ground, unfortunately.
Yeah, that is, of course, it's really unfortunate that we're seeing some very heartbreaking signs. Mr. Farhadi, just stay with us. Professor Scott Lucas, I beg your pardon, also joining us this afternoon. Professor Lucas, there is one aspect of this in terms of what does the takeover of the Taliban mean for Afghans within the country. Now, there is also the issue of its implications for the stability and the security of the entire region. With this new development there, does China, Pakistan, is there going to be a realignment of forces and a stronger axis of power emerging from here?
Well, I think, as Mr. Farhadi mentioned, the priority is what happens to Afghans inside the country. But beyond it, you will not have an international response now. You'll have each country deciding whether to isolate the Taliban, whether to set conditions on engagement, such as the way the Taliban behaves inside the country, or whether there are no conditions on engagement. And I think it is very instructive in three different ways, three different responses. The US is now on the sidelines. The US has now effectively left the building. China, on the other hand, has moved quickly, even more quickly than I thought, which is to say, effectively, we want friendly relations. In other words, a move towards recognition of the Taliban as part really of China's expanding economic and political footprint through Asia, including China's relations with Pakistan, next door to Afghanistan. Pakistan has not gone that far. They've not gone that far to say, okay, we're going to recognize the Taliban. In other words, Pakistan is going to try to bring different factions together or find some way that it's not just simply a Taliban-only Afghanistan, which is why you have representatives such as former President Karzai who are right now in the talks in Pakistan. I can't tell you which way this is going to play out, but what I would say to you right now is, especially as I speak to you from the UK, that quite often our media focuses on what the UK does or what the US does or even what Europe does. Right now, I think the key players for the immediate future in terms of what happens in the region are the regional powers, Pakistan, China, the Gulf states, and please don't forget Iran as well, which was the leading power in the West.
Mm-hmm. And let's also throw in Turkey into the mix there. Professor Lucas, you did mention the peace talks that are underway. Now, let me just take that to you, Mr. Farhadi. You've been a big critic of Ashraf Ghani. I believe you've also tweeted saying that he missed out on an opportunity to save the country. But in terms of the talks, what were the other solutions or the other alternatives to what we're seeing as the situation currently? What else was on the table for Afghanistan and a stable and peaceful future, which is not entirely driven by the Taliban?
What I said on Twitter was that Ashraf Ghani will be remembered in history as the president who lost a century worth of opportunity for Afghanistan. Because when he took over 7 years ago, he could have handled things differently, and probably even the West would have stayed if things would have evolved in a more peaceful way, if he had found to pacify a number of Taliban or members of Taliban to come into power with him. But he was unable really to break the monolithism of Taliban and bring them into power. He always challenged them, he demeaned them, and they became more crystallized. And himself was far from the people of Afghanistan. That's why neither the army, neither the people rose against the Taliban to protect him. And at the end, his three associates also offered the three provinces surrounding Kabul. Now, what we need to see, Afghanistan from a legal and standpoint is in a state of suspense because we have a fugitive president whose signature is valid for the central bank reserves of Afghanistan, which is $9 billion. And we have an unrecognized government, which the world is ready to recognize. Even the West, the UK, the United States, their system of recognition of a government is value-based. Value-based means you have to pronounce the words we like, human rights, women's rights, and then they say, okay, when you say this, we recognize you. All they want is for the Taliban to pronounce these words, but the Talibans are tough people, they don't. And that delays this recognition because nobody will verify really later what happens. Right now, the world body needs the Taliban to take their responsibility and pronounce a certain number of words. All we are asking them is to pronounce a certain number of words. And we know that in many countries, those words are pronounced and not practiced. But for the world body to recognize the Taliban government, this needs to happen. They need to come to Kabul and take their responsibility because now they have won the war. They have come inside the presidential palace. The former president is fugitive. He stole the money of Afghanistan. He's gone. He left with bags of money, reportedly, and even forgot 2 bags on the parking lot. Kabul News reported. But Now, at this point, Afghanistan is without a government, and that's a very dangerous state of affairs from a legalistic, status of country. The country doesn't. If an ambassador wants to meet with the ambassador of the United Nations, Afghan ambassador, we don't know if he's the Afghan ambassador or his president is fugitive. So we need to take Afghanistan out of this situation. We need to take Afghanistan out of the uncertainty. We need the Taliban to come in, make declarations, designate their leaders, give assurances to people so we don't have scenes like this that you see where people are trying to escape Afghanistan because they don't know what's happening next. Lay people in society need leaders to lie to them even, but they need leaders.
Well, Mr. Farhadi, let me play devil's advocate here to what you have said. Now, I understand realpolitik also many times involves appearing to do things than actually doing them. Let's assume the Taliban signed a document saying, there's going to be a peaceful transition. Let's assume they say girls are going to be allowed to go to school. There's going to be human rights, etc., etc. But none of this is necessarily going to translate on ground. There is no way that we can actually be holding the Taliban to account. We've learned that over several years. So what happens then? Is it all pretty much a sham where world leaders for their own, for their own conscience, so to speak, say we've got them to sign this and now we leave Afghanistan to its own fate?
It's almost like that, unfortunately. The reality is that everybody knows that after 20 years, even 40 years of war in Afghanistan, full peace will not come to Afghanistan, and there will be pockets of abuse in Afghanistan. There's also a problem of narcotics and drugs and human trafficking in Afghanistan. And when people want to be refugees, they're willing to sell everything and leave and go to Iran, and from Iran to Turkey, and from Turkey to Europe. And in the meanwhile, they are trading their dignity basically to become refugees. And the world is expecting right now. The IOM, International Organization for Migration, has said that 30,000 people are leaving Afghanistan every week. This might double. We see the picture here. It's very illustrative of what's happening in the minds of the people. So the people need assurances from the Taliban. The Taliban, who have won the military war and the political war, now need to have this wisdom to come in and give people the assurances that there won't be any settlement of scores there, that they will respect the dignity of people who have worked previously to the government because there's a general forgiveness or pardon. They have said these things, but their leaders have to come physically in Kabul and say this. We cannot live in the void now. And in Afghanistan, Karzai and Abdullah and Hikmatyar have said, when Ghani left, basically, we are it, and we want to make peace with Taliban. And so they're going to Doha, and tomorrow the Taliban should come to Afghanistan. They should take their responsibility. It's not important what kind of government they bring. They have to bring a government. We can start criticizing them based on their actions later. But right now, we are in a void of governance, which creates opportunity for a lot of negative activities.
Well, in your opinion, Mr. Farhadi, does that government have to be, or can it be, or will it be just an entirely Taliban-led and a Taliban-comprised government? Is it perhaps, at least for international acceptability, if not anything else, have certain elements of the Ashraf Ghani administration in it?
Ashraf Ghani escaped, left the country with bags of money and all his government. Those people will not come back. Afghanistan doesn't need those people. They are corrupt people. That's why the system was run to the ground. Basically, even the donors' money was stolen in Afghanistan by the people who the donors had tolerated all these years. So the people of Afghanistan also don't expect anything from Ashraf Ghani and his former team. They are not liked. But Taliban can bring a government with some figures from other parts of Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is composed of several ethnies and regions, and they can say, here, you wanted inclusive government, here's a Hazara, here's a Turkmen, here's an Uzbek, here's a Tajik. And yes, in the last years, the Taliban have added in their ranks those kind of commanders. In northern Afghanistan, in Takhar and Kunduz, they had commanders who were local commanders. So they can come in those governments, and we will have nothing to say because they will have representativity in this government. And if later they need expertise from other technocrats, they can call on them. And if the Taliban have not done any exactions of human rights and everything is going well. Everybody wants to work with them to bring things in Afghanistan to a better conclusion than what the images you see right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Scott Lucas back with us. Professor Lucas, I think we lost the line with you a bit over there, but Mr. Farhadi was telling us that, we have to have some sort of assurance from the Taliban that they're going to adhere to human rights, they're going to adhere to women's rights. Do you think that that is something, if the Taliban do provide, the international community would have no choice but to recognize the Taliban? And is it in many ways something more for the international community to assure itself and to perhaps placate its own audiences that it's tried to do something as opposed to actually doing something?
The starting point for questions of rights and the everyday welfare and security of Afghans is for the Afghan people. I mean, that is one of the lessons that we have had not only from the past 20 years, but for many decades in Pakistan. Now, the international community can always be part of that, but it is a very tricky, a very difficult question. And that is that, first of all, the Taliban may not provide the type of rights that the international community expects, not because we're, quote, Western, but because there are very big debates over political, economic, and social rights, including, for example, the question of women's rights. At the same time, individual members of the international community may not be concerned first and foremost with those debates over rights or even the fate of the Afghan people. They have their own economic and political interest. So, for example, I doubt that China will be very concerned about the issue of rights inside Afghanistan. That is not their priority in the way that they will approach this. I think it is a very interesting question, a very important question, that the two neighbors of Afghanistan are watching, Pakistan and Iran, what are their priorities? Is it really on the behavior of the Taliban inside Afghanistan, or is it more fundamental, as it were, economic interest, especially with Iran having its own difficulties, tensions with the West, and with Pakistan being in a very, very interesting position, not only vis-a-vis Afghanistan, but of course vis-a-vis India. So I think it's sort of more turning a kaleidoscope when you talk about the international community. There's not a single international community here. It is, however, I think a fundamental, given that kaleidoscope, to maintain the focus on what is happening inside Afghanistan, trying to provide for peace and security for all peoples and not just for one faction.
No, I completely take your point that there is no concept of a monolithic international community because everyone's interests are so non-aligned. Everyone has their own agenda at hand. But you also mentioned India, and I want to get to that in just a bit. But let's just talk about Joe Biden and the role that he has in all of this. Now, the US presidency is something that, of course, several of them have been inheriting this mess in Afghanistan. But nevertheless, he's still the man who was in office when all of this has happened. Could he and should he have handled this better? Should there have been a reassessment of how and if at all such a withdrawal was necessary?
I think as an analyst, what I can tell you is that I can understand, I don't necessarily agree with, I understand the reasons why Joe Biden and his advisors made this very rapid U.S. withdrawal. They no longer saw it being worthwhile. Indeed, Joe Biden has opposed a significant American presence since 2009. They thought it was a waste of resources. They thought that their priorities lie elsewhere, beyond Afghanistan, including the competition with China. What I can say beyond being an analyst is I think that the speed of the American withdrawal, to the extent that when they left their largest base in Afghanistan, one of their largest bases in the world, almost overnight, without consulting or even notifying Afghan allies, that simply was an invitation to the Taliban to suspend the political process and to advance militarily. So it's the speed of the American withdrawal, which really forced the international community to withdraw then. There is the significance. Do I think that Joe Biden will pay a domestic price for that in the United States? I doubt it. I think many Americans are just tired of Afghanistan, unfortunately. Internationally, however, I do think it will have significant consequences because I think the United States here, whether or not Biden realizes it, has put itself to an extent on the sidelines. I think the idea of can you work with the United States, can you trust the United States, as we saw in the aftermath of Iraq in 2003, I think it's probably taken another dent here.
Mr. Farhadi, let me take that to you in terms of the US role and the fact that, they've almost abandoned Afghanistan. Same question, could and should the US administration have done more?
Actually, the US was very patient. The US spent real $187 billion in Afghanistan. Over 20 years, they spent $87 billion in military aid and the rest of it in development aid. And unfortunately, Afghanistan had corrupt leaders. When you go to Kabul today, you will see towers in Kabul. Where you live, the towers belong to an insurance company or to a bank. But in Afghanistan, these towers belong to people who have stolen the money that America sent for the military. They sent for fuel. People sold the fuel in the markets and lined their own pockets. There has been basically a lot of corruption in Afghanistan, which really, in the last 7 years, even became bigger. Just before President Ghani was deposed, or just before he escaped, $2 billion of customs revenues in Afghanistan were stolen every year by associates of President Ghani. And President Ghani wasn't doing anything about them. And the international community was losing patience about this corruption. They knew the fact that the fuel that they buy for the Afghan army is stolen in the market. Is sold in the market, stolen and sold in the market. They knew that the Ghani didn't have 300,000 soldiers. He had ghost soldiers, but he was charging the United States for salaries of 300,000 soldiers. Sigar, Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, documented all of that for Congress. And basically, at some point, the international community was being taken for a ride by a mob of corrupt leaders in Afghanistan, and there was no point. During COVID, really, the calling came that there was no point to support such a corrupt government with no strategic value for the West, because terrorism can be anywhere now, and it wasn't really in Afghanistan after 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Lucas, one last question before we wrap up. You did mention India. Now, how should India be approaching this? Because our approach towards Afghanistan, obviously, after the Taliban left, was very, very different. We tried to make inroads there, both diplomatically, both in terms of installations. We did try all of that, but now, obviously, it's time to pivot our position entirely. And also, we've been edged out completely when it came to the Doha talks. So, for an Indian administrator, for an Indian policy mandarin, how do they now approach Afghanistan, Taliban? Should they have perhaps some talks with them? Is that something that should be on the table?
Again, it's not up for me to tell anybody how they should approach this very difficult situation. Analyzing it, however, I suspect that India will be very cautious, at least in the near future. They'll be assessing what type of Taliban is in power. They'll be assessing the other factions in Afghanistan that Mr. Farhadi is talking about. They will be assessing whether we have a continuation. And Mr. Farhadi is quite right in the idea that for years, India had worked with as long as with other powers, with a government which at the end of the day was corrupt and therefore was unreliable and even illegitimate for many Afghans. In other words, they'll assess whether the Taliban can be not only legitimate, but whether they will be, in other words, far from corrupt. And it will not just be India that I think will take this wait-and-see attitude. I go back to the fact that while Pakistan's being very active at the moment in trying to work with different Afghan factions, Iran is being extremely cautious in how they deal with the Taliban, to the point where in their messages in the last 24 hours, they do not even mention the group. So I think, with the exception of China, which could be a game changer here, everybody right now here is just playing this very, very carefully, because I think you see the turmoil on your screens right now, and it could be some time, days or weeks, before we have any type of, I wouldn't call it stability, but at least a pause where you can start to think diplomatically where you go next.
Yeah, well, incidentally, Iran's president has said that the U.S. defeat in Afghanistan is a chance for lasting peace in the country. So they're viewing this very, very differently, as, of course, Professor Lucas Scott was also explaining why. But, gentlemen, thank you so much for speaking to Mirror Now. I appreciate you taking your time out. Of course, this is an evolving situation, and we're going to continue our focus on the other side of a short break, so stay tuned.